Well, finally, good morning, and you've probably seen from the B-roll that I've been in and out of the forest for the past hour or so, and I've been looking for something, just one shot, and I've been looking for something quite small and sort of intimate this morning, because there's no light around, there's no sun, there's no drama in the sky, so I'm going to exclude all of that, and what I'm going to do is take you through the shot from start to finish, the one shot I've identified. Now this is the location I've identified as being the shot I want to shoot, and I have this tree behind me here, which is going to be, I wouldn't say the centre point, but it's the main element in the shot, and there's some lovely foliage around it, and excuse me, the midges are absolutely biting me to death, and I'm going to set it up with the 4x5 in a vertical format, and I want to try and encompass that beautiful tree trunk in there with all that lovely detail and some of the foliage around it, but it's actually quite tricky as a technical shot, as I'll show you while I set the camera up. First things first, let's get the Intrepid set up on the tripod, levelled off, pretty much standard. You know, you set the camera up in a default orientation before you start with large format. You get everything in the right position, and then you start to make adjustments. So you get the front and the back standards level, you get everything straight with the little spirit levels, little bubble levels on it, and we're then going to decide on what lens we're going to use to take this shot. Now this is the setup I've chosen. I'm going for quite a tight crop, and I've gone for my standard 150mm Nikkor lens. That's your typical 50mm in full frame terms. Now this is forming the left hand side of the frame, and I'm going to have these branches coming through here and a little bit of the foliage, but not too much, because I have massive technical problems with a large format camera. I can't do the depth of field. Now I can't use movements in the forest because I have vertical objects, and if you tilt a large format camera, you get the top of the picture will be out of focus and the bottom and the center will be in focus, because you're moving the plane of focus down as you tilt. So I'm going to crop in, not too tight. I do want some of this foliage in here, but I'll start by loading up my 150mm lens, onto the camera and doing some rough focusing. Okay, so let's just drop the lens onto the front standard there, clip it in place, and I'll whack the aperture wide open, because I'm going to be doing the viewing in a second through the lens. All the composition is done through the lens, obviously, and I need the maximum brightness. Now it's very dull here, so it's still going to be quite tricky to focus it up. Put my dark cloth on so I can actually view the back of the screen, because it's so dim on the back of these things. It's really difficult to view unless you're in very, very bright light and the subject's well illuminated. Now what I typically do with my large format shots is I actually have a pair of reading glasses, because my eyes aren't brilliant close-up anymore, and I think these are a +2. Now these allow me to get underneath the cloth and actually get a decent distance from the ground glass, yet still see the entire image to give me a rough idea of what I'm focusing on. Now each large format camera has its own way of focusing. Now this is a later Intrepid, and there's a very, very nice focus knob on the bed here. Instead of groping around the front of the camera on the earlier models and some other cameras, I can just focus it smoothly here. It's very, very nice, very precise, and it's got just the right amount of damping in there. And when I let go of it, it ain't going to budge unless I give it quite a turn. So it's a very nice, easy focusing mechanism. And I rack that in and out, as you would with manual focus on your typical cameras, until I see it sharp. Right, well after much faffing about now, I have a composition set up fairly accurately. Now I say fairly accurate because it's very dark here in the forest. I can't really see all the elements of the composition in fine detail. And also what I'm going to have to do now is decide on my aperture. Now this shot is very tricky, as I said earlier, because there are elements at the front of the frame which are just far too close to focus with a large format camera whilst holding the background. So I made the simple decision to focus onto the tree itself, the tree trunk, and I'm going to stop down to f32 for the first frame, in the hope that I will pull enough depth of field in there. Now there will be some twigs and leaves out of focus, that's a fact, I accept that. It's just going to look that way. Hopefully it won't be too distracting and there won't be key elements. Now I don't like to stop down to f32 because it's about the limit of the lens maximum sharpness. But I'm actually going to go for the second frame for f45, and I'm going to just see if that diffraction affects the image to the point where it annoys me, because it will give me more depth of field. This will go down to f64, I wouldn't use it at that. So take 2 frames now, let's pick the film. Now you probably won't be too surprised to learn that I'm using Ilford HP5 Plus. It's a film I absolutely love in all formats. Now in large format the detail is incredible. There's a bit more grain than the slower films, but you know, I have a negative that's 13 times larger than full frame here. So I have a ton of detail. Now also I have a bit more speed than something like FP4 Plus. And that's going to give me the option of, you know, looking out for any of that motion blur with like leaves moving about. But however, it'll all come down to the metering. Now that's when I use my trusty Sekonic spot meter. Now there are a number of elements I must ensure I get correct in terms of metering while I'm doing this shot. Now I have the tree trunk, but that's not going to be an issue. It's not particularly bright. There's no real highlights in this scene. It's the shadows I'm going for. Now I'm going to be metering around the base of the tree here, and also, you can see me still, into this foliage around here at the back, because this forms an important, this forms an important part of the scene, into these ferns here and this undergrowth. Now that needs to have some detail in there. I don't want it black. I want to be able to pull some detail out, so I must make sure I get enough exposure for these particular areas. So I'll take my meter reading now, and then we'll work out the exposure. I've set the lens up, I'm all focused, I have the film holder in place here. I have the lens connected up with the cable release, and I'm going to do a quick test firing of the shutter. I always test fire my shutter before I make a real exposure, so I know it's working. So I'll just cock the shutter again, and for this one I've estimated, as I say, a 15-second exposure. Now HP5 Plus has reciprocity failure, so it gets slower as exposures go above 1 second. So the real exposure time is around 35 seconds. Now that's calculated just using Ilford's tables. Essentially you need more exposure as the exposure gets longer with these older films. So let's go for that 15-second exposure. Make the exposure using our little stopwatch. Then we replace the dark slide with the black face showing outer, and that means that it's been exposed. Okay, so that's the exposures made. Let's get back. I'll get these developed quite quickly in my little Stearman press tank. I did a video a few weeks ago about using different methods to develop 4x5. Get this developed, let's get it into Lightroom, and let's have a little quick look at the shots, see what worked, what didn't, whether the compromises with depth of field were okay, and how it worked out with f32 versus f45. Okay, so here are the 2 images in Lightroom. I've developed them, scanned them identically, exactly the same settings, and because the shot was taken in the same position, they are an identical image in terms of composition. Now let's have a quick zoom in and see what we can see. Okay, now these are unsharpened images, f32 on the left, f45 on the right, and to be honest, I'm not really seeing any difference whatsoever in this area. It all looks very similar. So let's zoom in on an area where there's a bit more fine detail, just to see if we can see any difference in sharpness or fall off. Now I can actually see here, it may not be clear on this video because it's only going to go on 1080, the image on the left over here is a bit sharper than the one on the right. Now both of these elements were in the plane of focus, so a little bit of diffraction is robbing some more sharpness from the f45 shot. However, if we actually dig down into the background and see if we can see any benefits to stopping down, this area here at f32 is quite soft. These are in the deep forest well behind the main plane of focus. These are a bit sharper at f45. There's a noticeable difference there, so that is one advantage of stopping down. I've got a bit more depth of field, certainly behind the focal plane. And just looking in this area at the back here, now this is another area where the focus has fallen off a little bit more at f32. f45 it's probably acceptable. It's not much difference, to be honest, and you may not see it clearly unless you're watching on a big screen, but there is a difference in depth of field there, certainly. But in terms of sharpness, I have to say that the f32 image is a little bit crisper to my eyes. It's not massive, it really is only a subtle difference, but all of these objects which are in the plane of focus are a bit sharper, a little bit sharper, but then again, this is a really big enlargement off a big piece of film. So let's have a look at the images as I processed them with a bit of sharpening, a bit of dodging and burning, and see how they compare then. So these are the two final images. I made all the adjustments to the f32 shot, and then I just copied and pasted them over identically to the f45 shot. So everything is the same, the sharpening and all the manipulations in terms of colour, clarity, etc. Now that little bit of sharpening has really just punched up the detail levels across the whole frame. These are beautiful and crisp now, but the f45 ones aren't far behind, and I could apply a bit more sharpening here, a bit more excessive sharpening just to bring them up to the same levels of f32. So pretty much of a muchness. And also in the depth of field, obviously it's not going to improve the depth of field sharpening it, but this is now not a bad level of sharpness for something so tiny in the frame. But again, it's a bit more defined in the f45 shot because of that extra stop on the aperture. It's just brought it in a little bit further. So overall, I have to say that in this instance, it's not made an appreciable difference. Stopping down has given me a bit more depth of field, but it's also robbed me of a tiny bit of sharpness. I think a better comparison is one I'll do next time, when I will shoot at something like f16 or f22, which is really the optimal aperture for this lens, and then stop right down, and we should see a more noticeable difference there. But yeah, I do hope you found that interesting. It was quite useful, and it's something that for me means I will probably stop down to f45 in the future if I think I need it, and recover it later with a bit of sharpening in Lightroom. So yes, thanks very much for coming along on this short trip, and I'll see you again soon.